And good evening, everyone. Stephanie, Mandy, Linda, and Char, and whoever else is here is greenteacher.lea. My name is Tim Grant. We have a nice small group here, and we're going to have some fun. You're in for a real treat. I'm so delighted that Mary Rivkin is our presenter this evening. I've known Mary for almost as long as I've worked on Green Teacher, about 20 years. She's been one of those champions of environmental education, but particularly early childhood education, outdoor learning, and schoolyard habitat. She's been sort of on the cutting edge for a very, very long time, and I was just thrilled when she agreed to do this webinar for us, and I will introduce her properly in just a moment. And I think some of you have been on our Stephanie, I know you've been on our webinars many times, but if, in case a couple of you are brand new, I want to give you a sense of where we're going over the next 60 minutes. Mary will continue with her presentation start her presentation in a few moments and finish up in about 30 minutes. And then we'll turn it over to you guys for questions. But you don't have to wait to ask a question. And in fact, we'd be delighted if you took a moment and used the chat room to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and perhaps tell us what, briefly, if you have some experience in making cities better for children in any small or large way. That would be great. And the way you do that is to go to the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen where it should say main room. And to the right of that is an empty horizontal box in which if you type a message like, "Hi, I'm Tim and I'm from Toronto, Ontario, and I've helped make bike lanes, separated bike lanes in my neighborhood." Then I would type that in, and then I would hit enter on my keyboard, and that would propel the comment up into the chat box. So feel free to respond or ask questions. If there are any technical difficulties, by all means, make a comment in the chat box, and we'll do what we can. And thanks, Stephanie, for getting us going. And if you're not familiar with Green Teacher magazine, let me just say a word that, as I mentioned, we've been publishing for 20 years the most innovative articles, activities, and lesson plans developed by youth educators inside schools. And in the past 10 years, we've had the pleasure of publishing 6 books. And over the last 2 years, we've started this webinar series, which has been great fun, and it's allowed us to work with many of the people who've written for the magazine, a lot of the innovators in the environmental education field, and that brings me to Mary Rivkin. As you heard moments ago, this presentation is being archived, so you don't have to take notes. And please let your friends know about it afterwards. They can view it freely. They don't have to be subscribers for the next 30 days. If you find this session to be worthwhile, please let your friends know. Share it on Facebook and so forth, and encourage people to have a look. Now, without further ado, Mary Rivkin. As I mentioned, she's been a pioneer in the early childhood education movement, linking early childhood education and environmental education for many years. Not surprisingly, she's an associate professor in that very field, early childhood education, at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her research interests include, not surprisingly, outdoor play, environmental education, and community organization, and she's published a couple of noteworthy books. The first was very recently actually, Science Experiences in the Early Childhood Years, an Effective Integrated Approach. She co-wrote that. The edition just came out this year. She co-wrote that with Jean Harlan. And back in 1995, she wrote a book that's currently being revised for republication next year called The Great Outdoors, Restoring Children's Right to Play Outside. And she's not just an academic, she's also working to save a nature trail in her neighborhood in Bethesda, Maryland. Mary, welcome to you.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everybody. I am so happy to be with you. My presentation is going to be part or the basis for a chapter in my revised book, because since 1995, Getting children outdoors has really changed a lot, which is a wonderful, wonderful trend. This is going to be about advocacy today, things I think that we as individuals and small groups can do. We can't do everything, but we can do some things. This is a brand new park in one of the world's mega cities, LA. It does show that some people have been acting to make this part of the city good for children and adults as well. Let me ask you a question. What are you advocating for in your neighborhood or city, or have you advocated for? I have to say there are limitations to my expertise here. I'm not an urban planner, but am a parent of 4, grandparent of 6, and a teacher, and I notice things. I strongly believe we need to be advocates that children need us. Now, cities are where the world is going. That red line is urban population growth, and the green line is rural population decline, actually. It's about 2010 that those lines cross. By the end of the century, it is predicted that there'll be 8.5 billion people living in cities of all sizes and 1.5 billion people living rurally. So the definitions of urban and rural are not hidebound, but this is approximately what the UN and all of its experts say. Now, why do people go live in cities? Because they want to make a living and they want to have opportunities. You can see these 4 countries are far along the way to being very, very urbanized. So, why, when we think about cities, should we think about children? Well, more people, more children. There was a study called Growing Up in Cities. It was done in the 70s, and then it was done again in the 90s. Louise Chawla led it, and UNICEF paid for it. What is it that children want and actually need out of cities? This will sort of guide our thinking here. These children were 10 to 18, but, you know, if you're 6 or 7, pretty soon you're going to be 10 to 18. So I think that these are well articulated. Number 1, they want social integration. They want to feel part of things, be welcomed and valued by the city, by their neighborhood. They want a variety of interesting settings, places to play, to meet, to shop, to run errands, and be away from adults. They want safety and freedom of movement, sense of safety and being familiar with adults in the community, and places where they can get about freely. Peer meeting places for play and socialization are important, little corners and niches for them. Cohesive community identity is highly desired. That's not something we can necessarily make overnight or change. It's developed historically. But green areas, they have to be accessible. Parks, wild areas, and sports fields. Now, these desires are supported by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Children not only want these qualities, they have rights to them. And you know the United States has not ratified that particular treaty. So the topics today for making cities better are safer streets, getting about with connectivity, walkable communities and complete communities, parks and play spaces, and the right to nearby nature. And then I will talk about a couple of advocacy tools as well, the HIA and the children's HIA. I'm going to start with streets because the fear of traffic is a major reason children are not out and about the way we wish. This fear is quite justified. In the U.S., in 2009, about 11 pedestrians per day were killed and 162 more were injured. And sadly, 5 to 9-year-old boys that have the highest death rate because they're impulsive and quick. In the U.S., most transportation money goes to roads. I think we need to change that. Now, here is a fact for you. If you're hit by a car at 20 miles per hour, you will probably live. At 45 miles per hour, you're almost certainly dead. And if you're old, like grandmothers, you'll probably die at both speeds. Anyway, traffic calming is a major thing. It's a terrific idea, even though many drivers resent it. It involves engineering to change the alignment of streets to slow down traffic. So that could be center aisles in the middle of the road, speed bumps, traffic circles, narrowing of curbs, and then street diets to slim down the number of lanes. I want to show you in my neighborhood a project that took 10 years to get. That traffic island in the middle, and the houses on one side and the schools on the other side. But you can see what was a 4-lane road has now been slimmed down to 2 lanes in a big circle, at a big traffic island. So that's one thing that can be done, even if it takes time. Another thing that's recent in New York City are these slow zones where the speed limit's 20, the speed at which you can typically live. And that has just started recently, where there's community support, childcare, seniors, schools, and transit. So it's a bit restrictive, but it's a really good idea for old people and children. Now I want to show you where there's very minimized traffic, not just somewhat slow traffic. It's extremely slow here in the Booner, which is a residential street in Europe, particularly. It's been in Europe for years. This one's in the Netherlands. Note the sign showing the pedestrian and a little child kicking a ball and small cars. 2 million people in the Netherlands live on this kind of street. Cars cannot go faster than the pedestrians walking. In this case, the street belongs to those who live on it rather than those who wish to go from point A to B on it. It's shared space with pedestrians, and especially children, having priority. Toronto, Seattle, Asheville are among the North American cities experimenting with the Booner concept. The UK for a while had a program for home zones. Safe streets with no traffic at all are really ideal. I tried to embed this video for you, but I couldn't. But if you write that down, it's an excellent video about advocacy to change a very trafficky street adjoining a park into first a safe street, first for Sundays, then for all summer, and now the citizens have got the powers to be persuaded it's going to be changed into a plaza or park-like with no traffic on it at all. So it can be done.
Mary, I'll just jump in here. Tim,
Sure.
I'll make sure that we include this URL in the email that we send to all the participants tonight and all the people who registered, and we'll send that out tomorrow so people don't have to write it down. It's a long one.
Okay, and I also think I put it in the website at the end. We got a whole page in website. Now, just recently in the U.S., really just a few weeks ago, a large initiative for 40 safe streets in 10 cities was announced. It's noteworthy that this Queens project was about play and social interaction, but this new initiative is about combating obesity. Blue Cross Blue Shield, our big health insurance company, and Partnership for a Healthy America, Michelle Obama's part of that, are the sponsors. So whatever it takes to get safe streets, either play or obesity or social interaction. All fine. Keep the cars away from the children, is what I say. And another way of keeping cars away from children is safe routes to school. Now this program was invented in Denmark. It's called Safe Routes to School in the U.S., Active and Safe Routes to School in Canada. It's been implemented for some years. In the United States, only since about 2005. So the advantage of safety is now linked with exercise, sociability, and community building. It's a very winning idea. In the U.S., federal funds support the program, which have been or will be in only about 13,000 of the 99,000 public schools. It's quite simple to implement. Here's a walking school bus on the left and a bike train on the right. In the U.S., parents typically lead the buses and trains. Now, biking is increasing a lot in the U.S., but really children should not be riding the streets. We need separated and safe bike paths for children. It's just dangerous any other way. There's a great organization, Pedestrian and Bike Information Organization, and they have a lot of guidelines on making bike paths safe for children. And I think we all need to pay attention to it. It's really connected to the whole new concept in this country anyway of complete streets. Now, a complete street has a sidewalk for pedestrians, bicycle lane for bicycles, and constrained lanes for cars and other vehicles. So there's a movement across the whole country to have complete streets. It was something I found out in my research. That might be useful to you. There's a national coalition for complete streets. Now, connecting the things we plan for children, homes, schools, and parks, is really not quite enough for them because they need to get places besides this. They need to go shopping, run errands. They need to go to the variety store, the bike store, the computer store. In some neighborhoods, the liquor store that sells candy, the drug store. There are a lot of places children need to get to by themselves. Middle grades and above need to get to those places independently. It's good for their characters. This whole idea of wayfinding is something that's just not a lot written about as near as I can figure out. It's an evolutionary skill. It's what we did when we found our way around the woods and the deserts and everything before we had GPS, before we had cars. It builds independence, it builds mental mapping, a sense of place. I think there's probably a sensitive period for it, middle childhood, but I'm having a hard time finding a research. If any of you know about this, let's put our heads together. It is certainly not fostered by speeding through places in cars or school buses, but it's fostered by walking and biking and exploring. It's a bit avoided, a bit not taken care of, I think. Another way to avoid traffic is to have trails. Now, this trail is an old railroad bed. It goes over a highway there on the left, and it goes right through the town there on the right. And this is like many trails in America, an old railroad bed, flat, good for bicycling, good for walking. This particular one goes under two highways and over a third right here in the town. Now, this is disputed land. You can hear me getting excited. My own advocacy is to save this trail from light rail. Transit is good, but isn't fresh air, exercise, and nearby nature better? This is really a values clash. So my advocacy has been letters, testimony to the planning board, testimony to the county council, op-ed pieces, buttonholing officials when they show up, and a lot of persistence. I think I've been doing this for about 5 years, and it just goes on. But, and working with other people too. But on the subject of old railroad beds, I want you to look at this one if I can get you through it, get it to come up. Oh, here, connecting above ground. This is the High Line in New York City. It's an old railroad that was just abandoned. It was about 20 or 30 feet up in the air. And suddenly it started going to wildflowers. People said, this is a nice wild place. So now it's been all tamed up, lots of donors, lots of money thrown at it, and advocacy, and it's a beautiful place in New York City. It's quite different. Philadelphia and Chicago have similar projects for urban train tracks. And it is a lot about advocacy. Now, do you know about the walkability score? It's something that's going on. It's another way of judging how good a neighborhood is for children getting around and people getting around. The better streets, a little slow here. When we have better streets, better transit, and increasing density that can make neighborhoods more walkable. So this walk score has been around since about 2007. And you try to figure out how close are the stores, the movies, the schools, the parks, the healthcare, and the amenities on a scale of 0 to 100. So if you live out in the middle of the Sonora Desert, you probably have a 0. And if you live in Brooklyn, Fifth Avenue there, and Fifth Street, you probably have a 99. Now, why do people want to have walkability? Well, the younger generation, a couple of my kids are in this, they don't want to drive because of high gas, long commutes, the sense of isolation from too much screen work and working at home, increased CO2 levels. I think a lot of young people do not want to make the world get worse and worse, and they have this desire for sustainability. As far as children go, it's great for children because it's less time in restricted car seats, which I think are probably not good for kids. And there's more to see than when you're in the car all tied down. There's more to see and notice along the way, too, when you're walking. It builds a sense of place in children and in adults. This works on social integration. Now, I have an app app on this. It's a free app to get your walk score. I think it's not totally perfect yet because the things it showed for my neighborhood were places I never wanted to go. But anyway, it's a great idea, and it's going to be perfected by crowdsourcing when we all put in things we think are good about our neighborhoods. Now, high walkability is part of a complete community. I recommend this to you. It's a new report from Reconnecting America. The whole idea that we could live in cities and we could work in cities and then live far, far out hasn't worked out very well in this country. It's a lot of sprawl, and it's not working out. So there's a lot of desire to rebuild, particularly the inner suburbs, which is starting to get kind of ratty. So the inner suburbs as well as the downtown. And there are lots of places in the U.S. where you can build on areas that already have dense population or the possibility for it, such as you need short blocks, transit corridors, vacant lots of buildings, and it should need revitalizing. And then you can build on walkability. That would make a complete community. It's making the cities more attractive, but you should keep economic diversity because in the U.S., 1 in 4 children live in poverty. So in developing these new complete communities must keep affordable housing for families and for older people. It's good for children to have neighborhoods with working people and new amenities. Can't allow gentrification to overwhelm who is already there. So it's a pretty positive way of looking at the human race. So for us, we should advocate for zoning policies that keep neighborhoods a healthy combination of economic classes and opportunities. Live-work zoning is a good idea. Do it all in the same place, not all the houses one place and the businesses another. To have these complete communities, we do really need to have better transit. Here's a picture of light rail in Madrid. This is good because it makes the air cleaner for children. There's less particulates for their lungs. There's so much research how even the particulates now influence babies in utero. So it is helped by transit. Here's Madrid, like cities here and around the world are investing in light rail or LRT. VRT, or vehicle rapid transit, is an option. It's much cheaper. Light rail is very controversial in lots of places and is expensive, particularly light rail. The Fraser River Valley of British Columbia, for example, the financing for light rail is very multi-layered and very, very complex. There's a toolkit for it, a Transportation for America website, if you want to get into a long project of it. If they get that light rail on the trail I'm trying to save, it's the federal government, the state government, and the county government. And the price tag for 16 miles of light rail is going to be $2.2 billion. So you have to think about that. Now, it's certainly in the works. Parks are a vital, vital green space for children. According to the Trust for Public Land, only 7 major cities have parks within a 10-minute walk for 90% of their residents. Trust for Public Land has developed a park score that's a useful advocacy tool for the 40 largest cities in the U.S. based on access, acreage, funding, and services. And you can use it in your city scoring to find out how good your parks are. You get 5 benches if you have a good park, and 0 if you don't have a good park. There are some trends in this new emphasis on parks. One is participation by users, including children. Robin Moore led the design of this playground in Cary, North Carolina. It was a community effort with the children participating in the process, even naming it. Participation is one of children's rights, according to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as a conclusion of the Going of the Cities study I mentioned. Another trend in new park design is using the principles of universal design. This park has ease of mobility for everyone. Winding paths and ramps are integrated into design. Terrace swings are side by side with regular swings. Varied surfacing on the walkways provides textural cues, and lush landscaping appeals to the sense of sight, touch, and smell. The restroom facilities include adult-sized changing tables and extra room for wheelchairs and strollers. Another group that is making headway on parks and playgrounds is Kaboom. Now, Kaboom is a nonprofit here in D.C. over the last few years has made the observation that play is vanishing from children's lives, and they have helped build more than 2,000 playgrounds across the country. They've instituted a Playful Cities program and numerous other initiatives. Their approach requires deep community involvement. They have an advocacy tool to achieve joint agreements between schools, school districts, and park districts to keep school grounds open in non-school hours. Apparently, there are quite a few school districts that lock their schools up after school and on the weekends to prevent vandalism, but I think Kaboom is right in saying that's really wrong. Children need those places to play. So they have a toolkit about these joint use agreements. It's called Playing Smart, Maximizing the Potential of School and Community Property. And that's obtainable online, too. The combination of good play spaces, well landscaped by the schoolyard habitats people, and recently documented in Sharon Danks' asphalt ecosystem brings me to my final and most heartfelt point. The Peerless Children in Nature Network, in their terrific collection of relevant research on the necessity of nature for children, has persuaded and continues to influence many people toward providing nature places for every child everywhere. The case has been made, really, per the biophilia hypothesis, which shows how we as a people evolved in nature and we're still deeply connected to it, not to mention dependent on its processes. We cannot and we must not let development pave over and sanitize with smartly trimmed shrubs and exotic plants the natural environment of each place. Children deserve to explore and play in what is their habitat, as well as the birds and squirrels. And I think sometimes the smart growth people, the complete communities people, are not aware enough of what I read. So this brings me to tools for advocacy that I hope you can pay some attention to. Come on now. This health impact assessment, I just discovered it earlier this summer. It's the HIA. This is a fast-growing field. It's used all over the U.S. by decision makers to assess what the impact on health of certain decisions would be. It's multi-perspective and engages various sectors of the community. Here's the website. We're going to be using it in my group's effort to save the trail because we need an HIA to pull together all the stakeholders. It's kind of like an environmental impact statement, except it is broader because it's got a lot of people. Now, if we put the rail on the trail, as is planned, I'd want the county health department to assess the impact of much lessened access to the trail for thousands of people. I think it's 1 million people a year on that trail. And if there's a train on there and just a little narrow sidewalky trail, isn't that going to be huge? And then we need the State Department of Transportation to assess the effect of taking cars off the road with trains for pollution reduction. And then the budget people would assess the effect of money going to the train that could go to health. And another group would be the bicyclists who use the trail for exercise. How do they feel about a train? Pediatricians who are prescribing in this country outdoor play for children now, and advocates for children's mental health, and then advocates for wildlife, because that trail is used as a corridor, thinking green spaces at night, who will speak for the animals. And then schools along the trail that want safe routes to school. So this is going to be interesting to see how this turns out. If we can get it, everybody has to agree to do it, of course, and that's always a problem. If focusing more on children, you can do a CIA, or Child Impact Assessment, or Child Rights Impact Assessment, the CRIA, which is used in England, Scotland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and New Zealand, and probably some other places, as a way of protecting children from the consequences of decisions made about something else. And it's the rights of the child is outlined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think if we can't, in my case, get a HIA, we're going to push for a CIA. And I want to show you here. This is in my town, Bethesda. Montgomery County is the sixth wealthiest county in the country. Bethesda Chevy Chase is a very affluent suburb. And this is what is provided in a child care center right here in Bethesda. Now, where is the necessary nearby nature for young children? You see some trees in the background. That's actually the trail. That's good. But the children aren't there. So I think we have a lot of education to do. And I wonder if you know the relatively new book, Childism, by a Canadian, I think Toronto actually, psychiatrist Elizabeth Young Brule. She says that we are very prejudiced against children, and this would be an indication of that. That book just came out in December 2012. Yeah, we need to save the wild bits in the towns as we develop them, and this is what I see being quite difficult, needs a lot of advocacy for. This is a good advocacy tool. It's a short video that EPA put out, so it's free, and it's on the EPA website shown here. And it's saying save little wild places for children because they really need it. Doesn't have to. Don't make big mowed lawns and think that that's good. Save wild places where the animals and the birds and the bugs are, and that's really good for children. And I think that's hard, but I think we can do that. And let's see if that's the title. Joan Allman is a play advocate in this country, and she ends up the video with this quote. If we just give children little bits, little remnants, things that an adult would cast away and think nothing of it, but to a child it's a treasure that goes deep in their soul and lasts a lifetime. And this is Axel from across the street in my wildflower garden with a caterpillar that eventually turned into a butterfly. So, thank you for listening, and carry on for children. And I'll show you the website in here. All right. I think that's all of them. Any questions? I would love to talk about this with you. You're welcome.
Thanks so much, Mary. And by the way, we'll share this list of websites tomorrow in the follow-up email. And Mary, if you can advance us to the last slide,
where it says open-ended. All right.
Great.
You have a question? Oh, good. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you very much, Mary. That was terrific. You really gave us quite a huge overview of the real opportunities of making cities friendlier to children. And I think this is going to be give us a lot of food for thought and also the basis of many questions. I know I've got a few percolating in my head. And so, folks, as for those of you who are already familiar, you know that you can type in a question and hit in the screen area as you see it, and then press the submit button. And if you have a second question, just put one at a time in and hit the submit button, and then you'll get a blank screen, and you should be able to submit another. And if by chance you're having any trouble, feel free to use the chat box and type a question in there, and we'll retrieve it there as well. So, but let me start with you, Mary. You know, as I was listening to the range of the really nice overview of the kinds of projects that are child friendly and make cities friendly for kids, you know, your overarching point, of course, is that when we make cities friendly for kids, they become friendly for everybody. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, you know, there is that visionary architect in Seattle, Jason McLennan. He said, if we make cities safe for kids, they'll be good for us too. So I called him, and he said, one of the important things is that children should be on the ground. Don't put them up in high rises. Make sure that they're down on the ground and they can get around. So this doesn't mean we have to think about LA. This means we think about smaller cities as well. And there has to be nature, he said, and of course we agree with that. And of course it has to be safe for everybody. The streets, the people, a big mental health push probably, so people aren't so afraid. By the way, you want to know the statistics of stranger danger? I'm looking
Sure.
this up because I need to write it down. We're all terribly afraid our children are going to be kidnapped, right? But they actually, there are very good statistics on this. There's 2002, but only about 115 children a year are kidnapped by a stranger and taken away. Whereas cars we really have to deal with because children 14 and under, 311 of them as pedestrians and cyclists were killed in 2010. 23,000 were injured. So that's a total of 23,311 children were killed or injured. That's 64 children a day killed or injured as pedestrians or cyclists. This is ridiculous. No wonder parents don't want their kids out. We really, we just have to get cars under control one way or another for all of us, children and old people. Okay? I could go on.
Mary, I wanted to go back. I hadn't heard about that book you mentioned at the end, and of course it perked up when you mentioned this. The author was from Toronto, but I have heard the name of Elizabeth Young Brule. But you said the title of her book was Child. Could you?
Childism.
Yes, and could you describe? Could you define that for us?
She says, and the subtitle is Confronting Prejudice Against Children. So what's her evidence? She talks mainly about the United States. Her evidence is that in the U.S. we have the greatest percent of young people incarcerated in the whole world. We not only have the greatest number, but the greatest percent. We have no guaranteed health care for children until recently, and that's a little iffy. It's still ragged. We have no guaranteed preschool for children, even Head Start, which serves our lowest income children. Only 20% are enrolled. The Economist recently came out with a study, 45 countries, rich and poor. The U.S. was below the middle point on access to preschool, affordability of preschool, quality of preschool. It's pathetic. This is bizarre what we do in this country. You know, we have all these fusses about abortion and such. Every child deserves to live, but then we don't do right by them. So that's what she talks about. It's a very good book.
Okay. No, that's great. Well, that sounds pretty central, really, to your presentation here, too, which is that you've given us this range of projects and strategies that can help make cities more friendly for everyone, but particularly for children. I guess I want to turn the question and say, how is it that, or could it be the case that arguing for the needs of children will make it easier to do the traffic calming that Stephanie mentions in the chat box is currently underway in Rochester? How can we do you have any advocating for the needs of kids as a way to make it more possible to have traffic calming and many of the other strategies you mentioned in your presentation?
Well, Safe Routes to School money in this country has mainly been spent on traffic calming and making entrances to school and that kind of thing. So I think that point is understood here, and probably in Canada too, that traffic calming is good for children. The trouble with children is that we don't have a very broad view in this country. You know, Tim Gill in Britain, who goes on and on about risk, he says it just doesn't seem to be possible that people think there, and by extension here, that making streets safe for children really is a high priority. So we have a lot of changing of attitudes to do. People do want to, parents do want to protect their children. So, Tim, that is a huge question. I don't know how we get people to really care more for children.
Well, I do know. I think the first time we ever published an article, for example, about walking school buses and active and safe routes, I remember talking to a woman in the governor's office in South Carolina. It was their office that was promoting it, and she told me the story of a suburban elementary school that a grade 5 class was had sort of a mapping exercise and mapped out the streets that they felt safest in walking to school, and also mapped out. They also pointed out the laneways and streets where they felt less safe. And the biggest problem that was identified, the universal problem, was that many kids had to walk along a busy road that ran in front of the school, and there were no sidewalks. And so, needless to say, the group decided that that's what they were going to focus on, and they started. Then the whole class kind of kicked in and worked on a presentation with the teacher's guidance, and they made a presentation to the town council advocating for sidewalks, and they got those sidewalks. And I think it was a wonderful illustration, though, to both that you of how this sort of mapping process works. That kids determine what's safe, and then they move on to figure out how to get there, and they become advocates for those changes. So I was excited by the story because it says it has all the ingredients of what we need. Kids getting involved in the process, but also with that, really couldn't say no to kids, and it was because kids themselves were demanding safer conditions. And you know, I think we've seen that. I certainly, over the years of editing Green Teacher, have seen that over and over. So I guess that's really was the point of my earlier question. You know, I guess one of the answers to that question of how can the needs of children help us achieve things like traffic calming is if the kids themselves are advocating for it.
I think that's a great point. I wish I'd said that. That's a great point.
No.
I sometimes think schools don't have the energy around here, and we don't seem to have the energy for this kind of thing, so it has to come from the parents more. Anyway.
Well, and it's true, walking school buses and the lack of safe routes to school has really been a parent-driven movement. Those groups that advocate for walking school buses, and by the way, you mentioned it very briefly, but for those who aren't familiar, walking school buses are where one parent or a senior student would knock on the doors of other kids in the same class as their young son or daughter, and the whole group would walk together to school. So it saves individual parents having to drive their kids to school, gives everybody lots of exercise, and it helps build community. And I think the first time I saw a group in Toronto that was a walking school bus, they all had yellow scarves, which I thought was pretty cute. But it is a parent-driven movement, and that helps a lot too. The needs of parents do certainly get lots of priority when parents advocate for making things safer for their kids.
That's true, and there's a new group that started in Boulder called Frikers, but now it's called Voltage, that has children riding their bikes to school, and it's sort of a high-tech thing where the children's backpacks have a little chip in them, so when they go by a certain piece of hardware getting into the school, then that's recorded, and there are incentives for them, and that seems to be working very nicely in a lot of cities. And Safe Routes to School money here can be used to buy the hardware and software, so Voltage is another thing to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, I've never heard of Voltage. That sounds interesting.
I know. It was called Frikers for frequent bikers, but I guess they changed it. Anyway.
Sure. You know, I mean, the statistics are really quite startling. In the day when I was walking to school, and I don't want to remind people how old I am, but you know, at that point in the UK and the United States, generally 70 to 80% of kids, 30 and 40 years and more, walk to school, and now it's just the opposite. It's barely 20% in each of our three countries, and so it's and for safety reasons primarily. That's, you know, they say that sometimes 35% of more shower traffic in cities is parents driving their kids to school. So it's a huge contributor to many ills, and but I just, you know, the notion that kids fall out of bed, fall into a breakfast table, fall into a car seat, then they get out and walk in and fall into a classroom seat. The notion that those kids are ready for learning obviously is silly, and to have that kind of exercise, to walk to school with their peers, of course, changes that equation and provides a healthier start to the day, let alone reduced car emissions. And
I couldn't agree more. Once they get into school too, in the early childhood classes, the teacher says, "What's the weather today?" Of course, nobody knows.
Right,
because they weren't really in it.
They weren't really in it. Now, just going back to, as you said at the very outset of this presentation, Mary, you said that, that really what we all need to do is become advocates. And yet, as you know, there's many barriers to advocacy. Could you sort of talk a little bit about that? Why is advocacy so hard to do?
Well, one thing I figured out as I've been fighting for saving the trail is that the planning and capital budget timelines are really long. Like in our county, the capital budget is done 5 years ahead of time. So if you want something done, like a thing in the middle of the street, a traffic island, you have to be thinking about it a long time ahead. And you have to be very alert as to the timeline. And I think that's hard. It's a whole other system you have to memorize and be tuned into. Because usually when the bulldozers come, it's too late because a lot of money has already been spent and it's really, really hard to turn around. Although I did hear about a nuclear plant today that was turned around with the bulldozers. I think another thing, it's hard for us, I'm a school teacher, I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, to get the big picture of developers and politics and politicians. Where is the money and which way is it going? Maryland, for instance, is very famous for having this smart growth, capital S, capital G, movement. But it hasn't totally worked here either. And it's because the developers really have a grip on things. Nothing against developers. Every house we live in was made by a developer. But somehow things have got to be put in balance to have something. It's another sort of cultural change. How can we get people to care about the general welfare? So that's combating childism again. I noticed too, in the hierarchical nature of schools, activism is sometimes discouraged. Schools try to keep things very calm. So, Kim, you talked about children who are activists around their own school, and I think that's really good. But I do know of children that in some very conservative states here that acted for certain things, and everybody got their all twisted up on that. So it's a little tricky. I just urge us to be courageous and carry on and pay attention to the timeline and when things have to be done by. Like when I give testimony, it has to be turned in 2 days ahead of time. Okay, we'll do it.
No, well, you're absolutely right, and of course, your example of taking 10 years to get that traffic calming on that, or to get that traffic calming on that street that you mentioned at the beginning is certainly an example of that. And I've had experiences myself here in Toronto. I live downtown in a residential neighborhood, and we have done a lot of traffic calming over the years, and we're fighting now to get bike lanes. But when we turned our downtown residential neighborhood into a traffic maze, which means that every single block is a one-way street going the opposite way of the previous block, it means you can't drive through our neighborhood anymore. You have to go on the main streets. You can't use residential streets. But the reason I started telling you this was that they did a traffic count on the very block that I sit on as I speak to you now, and on this particular block, prior to the traffic maze, we had about 1,300 cars on a 24-hour period coming up this block. It was a one-way street beforehand, but it was 3 blocks, 2 major streets that were all in the same direction, so it got a lot of traffic. Well, 3 days after they put the traffic maze in, it dropped to something like 140 cars, or 11% of the traffic that it used to be, and it stayed that way. There's hardly any traffic, even though we're right in downtown Toronto. And on the very first day, my favorite part, it was nice, and the funny thing was, the very first day, I'd lived on the street for 10 years by the time that happened, and the very first day, there were kids out playing ball hockey on the street, and I thought to myself, how did they know that this has changed? But sure enough, they just knew there were there were no cars on the street, and indeed that's what did it. But it took a lot of persistence. It was controversial, and inevitably now I'm seeing that when people are trying to bring in a change like this, one of the best strategies is to say, let's make it a pilot project for 1 year. And in Stockholm recently, when the city of Stockholm did as London, England did, and they decided to restrict car traffic in the downtown area and charge a congestion fee, they decided to do a pilot project for 1 year because the majority, in fact, of people in Stockholm were opposed to it. A large minority were in favor, but after 1 year, the vast majority of people were in favor because they saw that the money was going to improve transit, and those who did drive could actually get somewhere better. Transit moved a lot faster, not just the cars, and the benefits were visible for all to see. So calling things a pilot project is another strategy that's been very successful.
Great. I can see that. Or, you know how they did in Queens too. They started slow, and they made it bigger and bigger each year. So.
Do you, Mary? You said when I introduced you, I mentioned that you were involved in saving a nature trail in your community. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there was this train track going up from one part of town to another part of town, and there was a train on it 3 times a week. It was a freight train. Well, then it stopped being used, so the track reverted to a nature trail. Now it's nice and flat, so it seems like a good idea to some people to put a train on it. But you know, that's not so good. Right now, in about a mile, there are 36 entrance points onto that trail. It's so accessible. You go out your backyard and get in that trail, or a road will end on that trail. But if you put a train on it, a 2-track train going 45 miles per hour, and you've got to fence it off very, very much. And anyway, children will go over the fences. And Maryland is 13th in terms of train fatalities, you know, killing pedestrians, killing people on the tracks. It just seems insane to me. Having the recession, the Great Recession, has been good because it slowed things down a little bit. It's really going to be expensive to put it in. But boy, is it complicated. Seemed like a good idea maybe 20 years ago, but now we know it's not a good idea to take away nature trails that 1 million people a year use, right?
No, that's absolutely true, and there's other ways of and often, of course, some of those trains are really bringing people in from quite a distance. May not be. There may be other ways of making that happen. Yeah,
it's one of those things. You look at a map and you see that maybe these 2 points could be connected. Well, why don't we do that? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Cost not being the least of them.
Absolutely, and I forget the name of the person who signed in as Green Teacher LEA. She or he mentioned in the chat box that you have a wonderful public greenway along which are several public schools, and you're advocating for the use of those greenways for science studies like water testing. I think that's a terrific way to kind of double up with what Mary was talking about, because you're providing another rationale for those greenways, and the more that they can get used, much the better. And I welcome further comments, if you would, about how any other comments you could make about that greenway project. It sounds fascinating. And similarly, Charlotte, from Charlotte, North Carolina, you must get teased about that a lot. For someone like yourself who teaches outdoor science and gardening in an inner city school, Montessori school, all the better. I'd be interested in what kinds of some of the experiences in outdoor science and linking that to making cities better for children.
Charlotte, can you hear?
And I'm looking at several comments. Mandy, you made an interesting one. Linda, you're at Texas Tech's outdoor school in Hill Country, as you say, beautiful country. If there are examples from your own communities about that relate to some of the things that Mary have said, please type them into the chat box. We'd welcome.
You know, Tim, as I was thinking about this presentation, it doesn't solve, the things I suggest don't solve any of the big problems like poverty, but they can make the cities we have maybe be better. It's not big policy. I think we still have a lot to work on there.
Absolutely.
Liking children better.
But I think in truth, it does tie in very much to the bigger issues. In my experience, all the things that you've talked about, that as someone who studies and follows urbanism, lives downtown, very active in my downtown community, I spent a long time looking at what other cities are doing around the world in precisely these kinds of issues. And in fact, when kids put on those yellow scarves and join walking school buses on their way to school, of course they are addressing climate change. They're not riding in cars with their parents. So in a nice, significant but small step, they're not only creating safer communities, they're getting exercise, and in dealing with tackling the obesity, they're also reducing car emissions by walking, and their parents are getting an opportunity to walk and gaining some free time and not having every parent take their own individual kids to school. So I use that as a quick example, but we could go on, and I think your park example is another one. And thank you, Mandy, for jumping in and mentioning about your own trying to connect across City Trail from the middle of town to the beach. What a great idea.
Yeah, where is that anyway, Mandy? Oh, good job. I think your example of children wearing yellow scarves, they feel that they're contributing to the world being better. It's not just their own safety. They're contributing to diminishing CO2. And I think that's really good. So
and in truth, absolutely. And in truth, change comes slowly, and it's done by 1,000 things. There are no magic bullets. And that, of course, makes it even harder to sell change awareness to people, because there is no magic bullet. And like many other environmental challenges, really making cities friendlier for kids, there is no one thing. And I think it was the strength of your presentation, Mary, that you really introduced us to 15 different alternatives and options that would help make cities more friendly.
When I got done with this, I started reading a new book called Playborhood. Don't know if you've heard of that. It's on a very local level. His father said, I want my kids to play outside the way I used to, and he made a list of all the things he wanted his children to do. And now he's turned it into a book. Just this year, it's a new book. And I'll send it out tomorrow on a list. But I recommend it.
You can send it to me tonight, or even first thing tomorrow morning. It'll be noon tomorrow that we'll send out the follow-up email, and along with the websites that you listed in that one of the last slides, and the other one with the video clip we were unable to show. We'll get that out so people can take advantage of it as well.
Yeah, good.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. It's probably a good time to wrap it up. I'm going to pull up a question slide and ask those of you still with us if you would mind taking a moment to fill out the questionnaire. In fact, I'll pull it up right now. And you'll see when you scroll down, there are basically 3 multiple choice and only 2 questions where you might be asked to answer with a sentence. But if you could take 90 seconds and fill that out, and you'll see a submit button at the bottom, that would be really great. Hugely appreciated. And Mary, if you hit the archive button while we're doing that.
Okay, I will. Thank you, everybody. Enjoyed the fact that you were there and I got to talk to you. Thanks, Tim.